Hello, good evening and welcome to the beautiful Portobello Bookshop for this very special event celebrating the launch of Homelands by Chitra Ramaswamy. I'm Peggy Hughes and I'm so very pleased to be here on this very auspicious occasion with Chitra and with Henry and with all of you here in store and with all of you who are joining us online to celebrate this very remarkable book. By day, I'm the Executive Director at the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, but by all other times, I am CEO of the Chitra Ramaswamy fan club. So both of myselves are on Clyde 9 tonight. Chitra, for those, and I know a lot of you know Chitra here in the room, is an award-winning journalist and author. Her first book, Expecting, The Inner Life of Pregnancy, won the Saltire First Book of the Year award and was shortlisted for the Polari Prize. She has contributed essays to a lovely array of different anthologies, including Antlers of Water, Nasty Women, The Freedom Papers, and so on. She's a TV critic for The Guardian and restaurant critic for The Times Scotland, and a columnist for the National Trust. So all of these wonderful accolades for Chitra. But this is also the story of Henry Wuga, so I wanted to quickly point out this. He's here, Kindertransportee, skier, chef, and gourmand, Holocaust educator, lover of the arts, storyteller, bow tie connoisseur, and Chitra's friend. So believe me when I tell you, in my line of work, you want to, with your whole heart, love the books by your friends with your whole heart, but I can honestly say that this is a beautiful book. Don't just believe me, though. Amna Modine for The Guardian said it is a cliche to describe a book as achingly beautiful, but those are the words I reach for. Homelands is both beautiful and, at times, left me with an ache I struggled to name. So let's get in about it. Chitra and I are going to talk for about 35 minutes, or thereabouts. Delighted to say I will then exit the stage and make way for Henry to join us, and we'll have some questions and reflections from him. And then it's a chance really for all of you to come in with your questions and comments, as well as online, and we'll field those. And then we will mill around as we are now allowed to do so, which is only a joy. So I'm going to ask you again to give a really warm welcome to Chitra.
Hello again. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Honestly, I'm blown away to see all your faces. Thank you.
Lovely. So Chitra, I mean, I love the blurb for this book, you know, the kind of the bits on the back. I mean, I love all of it, but I especially love this book is about two unlikely friends. Because I think it sort of sounds like the start of a wonderful TV drama about two unlikely. I would definitely watch that. I wonder if you can take us back to when this unlikely and very beautiful friendship began.
For sure. So I first met Henry Wuga in June of 2011, and I was working as a journalist for The Scotsman and Scotland on Sunday at the time, and it just was another job, really. I got sent across the Central Belt to Giffnock, which is where the majority of Scotland's Jewish population live. I'd never been there before, I didn't know it. And I spent the afternoon in the company of this couple who were then in their 80s. And they were Holocaust survivors, and they had come on the Kindertransport, which I'm sure you all know is an initiative that saved the lives of nearly 10,000 predominantly Jewish children in the 9 months leading up to the Second World War. So you can imagine the territory of our conversation. We were talking, you know, about some of the greatest atrocities that humankind had known and had perpetrated. And yet, this afternoon, it was just one of the most amazing encounters of my life. I spent hours there. They wheeled this absolutely beautiful 1960s tea trolley into the room that was laden with cakes and beautiful food, and they created this atmosphere of warmth, and they had this love of life that was so in perfect contrast to what they had, the hate that they had experienced. It was completely bewitching, and I fell in love with them, really. And when I left, I desperately wanted to be their friend, and more than anything else. And within a week, Henry and Ingrid had invited me back for lunch. And I felt very, very, proud of this until I discovered that they'd also invited the Scotsman photographer and his wife for lunch. So this just tells you what the Wugas are like, the level of kind of warmth and hospitality of this couple. And so I started to go back and we began a friendship, a very unlikely friendship. What I thought of as unlikely at the time, but the more I got to know them, the more I realized it made perfect sense on so many levels. And I kept interviewing them, and then I began to interview Henry more and more, and Ingrid a little less, partly because she had vascular dementia, and so interviewing her was a bit more problematic. And I interviewed Henry a few times for The Guardian. Any opportunity I got, I wanted to write about him. His story was so extraordinary, and he was such a beautiful speaker of his story. I just slowly felt that this book almost emerged like a sculpture out of stone. It happened at an absolutely glacial pace. I've never worked on anything for so long, but in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I started properly writing it and interviewing him at length, and I've amassed hundreds of thousands of words of transcript in the time.
Can you remember the moment in that long road to this book that you knew it was going to be this book? That you thought, this is a book, it's not just interviews and being friends with Henry and Ingrid?
Yeah. I had originally thought I was going to write a book of refugee and immigrant stories. And I thought Henry and Ingrid would form a chapter of that book. And I thought my own parents, my dad's here tonight as well, I should say, sitting in the front row, I thought they would form a chapter as well. So it would be the story of both refugees and immigrants. And then I started to realise that it was almost a way of not admitting to the fact that what I really wanted was to write an entire book about Henry Wuga. Sorry, Daddy. But it's a very unconventional biography in the sense that it really is the story of our friendship and a kind of conversation between our histories and our stories. It's not a straight-up biography of Henry Wuga. It's almost like it dovetails between memoir and biography.
Yeah. And before we hear a reading, how did this pitch, I guess, go down in the Wuga household? Was that well received? A kind of welcome idea?
Completely. Right from the get-go, Henry has been nothing but generous. And I showed him, as I wrote, I showed him chapter by chapter, and never once did he come back and say, I don't want to talk about this aspect of my life, or, you've got this bit wrong, or every single thing I wrote, he came back just as, I think of him now as my adopted Jewish grandfather. That's how I speak of him and how I feel about him. And he reacted always like a grandfather. It's fantastic, keep going, And that was all he ever said. And it was really one particular part of his life, actually, that I think as a journalist, really, I became obsessed with. And it was the first 23 months after his arrival in the UK. And so he came in the May of 1939, and he was here for a few months in Glasgow. He had a guarantor, a sponsor who took him in, basically. That's how the Kindertransport children got here. Their sponsors had to pay £50. And she was an immigrant herself, a Jewish immigrant called Mrs. Etta Hurridge. And so he stayed with her for a while. Then, there was all this beautiful detail. He ended up going and staying with the Sassoons in Kirkcudbright, and just these lovely little details. And then, all of a sudden, he'd been communicating with his family via letters that were sent through Brussels and Paris, which was still neutral at the time. But as soon as that changed, those letters stopped, and then suddenly those letters were deemed to be suspicious. And so Henry was called to the High Court in Edinburgh, and he was accused and instantly charged with corresponding with the enemy. And so he went from being seen as a friendly enemy alien, as they were called then, to a Category A, dangerous enemy alien. It's like the highest category that you can get. And he was only 16, just newly turned 16, and he was interned in 6 camps across Britain. And it was that story. I did not know that Jewish refugees were interned during the Second World War. And I don't think many British people know that. And I thought it was extraordinary that it took me to actually become friends with one myself to know that this had happened. So I wanted to write, I just thought it was like a spy thriller. And I thought I'd have to write this story. It's an amazing story.
Yeah. I mean, reading that, though, made me burn with rage. And I imagine you were fueled by that kind of, just the shaming sort of that happened and still happens, you know. Was that a fuel, would you say?
Yeah, I think I'm more, well, I don't like to speak on Henry's behalf, but I think I'm more fueled with rage about it probably than he is. Henry has this sort of amazingly magnanimous and very generous attitude towards his internment. You know, he in a number of interviews, he said things to me like, well, you know, it was wartime. People were very, very paranoid, and obviously that paranoia was being whipped up by the tabloids, as exactly the same as happens now. And he understood it. And it didn't tear him apart. But yeah, when I found out about it, not only was I outraged, I was like, this is still, versions of this are still happening, you know, when you look at detention camps and plans now to offshore refugees to Rwanda. So it's terrifyingly prescient, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. And we might well come back to that, unfortunately. But let's get into a little reading, I think. You're going to...
Yes.
Yeah, tell us which bit, please.
I am going to read right from the start of the book. So another kind of critical decision that I made, which really helped me, because this was a really very, very hard book to write, structurally speaking. And I didn't want to start at the beginning. You know, Henry was born in Nuremberg, and finish at the end. I wanted to write a book that treated history as a sort of continuum that you could keep going back and forth through, and for it almost the text to behave like memory, so that some chapters are very, very long in the way that some of our memories are very, very detailed, even if they might be about something really, really slight. And then some of the chapters are very, very short. And so I didn't know where to begin this book, so I ended up beginning it on Henry's 95th birthday. And so this is the prologue, and it's called It's the Truth. It is easy to know the beginning of things, but impossible at the time to see what exactly they begin. So I will start here on a recent Friday afternoon in the latter days of February, the day before Henry Wuga's 95th birthday. A staging post in a lifetime we sometimes call the Twilight Years. If a pin were to be dropped on a map, it would land on a lone and unexpected row of houses on the southern edge of Edinburgh, reached by an easily missed turn off a ceaselessly busy A road, and hemmed in on the other side by the Pentland Hills, which over the centuries have acquired some of the stately character of the city they overlook. It's hard to conceive how this particular stretch of houses came to be built on the nub end of the hills, not that long after Henry was born 1,000 miles away in Nuremberg. It's also impossible to imagine getting here on foot. As I cannot drive and am the daughter of lifelong non-drivers, my not driving has calcified over the years into a personality trait, like my love of a good laugh or Henry's notoriously sharp memory. The outcome is that I never know exactly how I get here. That is, until the car, driven by my very much a driver partner, Claire, pulls up outside the house where Gillian, the younger of Henry's two daughters, lives, and we make the short, steep climb to the front door. In years gone by, before age put an end to it, Henry and his wife Ingrid would already be waiting outside to greet us by the time we turned onto the street, framed by the door, side by side, waving and smiling, dressed in the carefully chosen and cared-for clothes of people who know how to live a good, stylish life. A photograph come to life, the kind you might find jumbled up with old postcards in a 50p box in a flea market. At the door, an affectionate but restrained hug would take place, the straight-backed kind reminiscent of so many fathers of a certain generation and their children. Then we would disappear into the house together. On this occasion, Henry is waiting for us in the conservatory, where a small afternoon tea has been laid out. The room looks directly onto a section of the Pentlands, which is home to Europe's longest dry ski slope. Skiing always makes me think of Henry and Ingrid. When I first met them, they were still taking to the slopes, by this time in their late 80s. Once, when Henry was in the spa town of Klosters, Switzerland, he found himself standing next to Prince Charles in the queue for the ski lift. "I mean," Henry laughed, though I was unsure whether his incredulity was about running into the Prince of Wales 1,200 metres above sea level, or the fact that he was standing in a queue. Henry, of course, said, "Afternoon, sir," and the heir to the British throne asked him where he came from, that polite inquiry that chases so many of us around the world. Whether formed in the mouths of princes or plebs, it always serves as a reminder, no matter where we happen to be or how benign the intention, that the possibility of our belonging here, or indeed anywhere, is questionable. Henry's reply, in this case, was Glasgow. But where did he come from before that, the prince probed, intrigued by Henry's strong German accent. This, too, is part of the script. And the older I get, the more I realise that there is no answer to the question that really satisfies anyone. It seems that the further we journey from birth, the more difficult it becomes to know where we come from. Perhaps home is not a place, wrote James Baldwin, but simply an irrevocable condition. Then came another question. "What is this you're sitting on?" I said, "It's a ski bob, sir," says Henry. And he said, "I've never seen one." And then the story becomes pure Henry Wuga, a haiku of this man's character demonstrating his respect above all else for things as they are, the facts. I said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but I've seen a picture of you sitting on one." And when the Wugas returned home from Switzerland, Henry located the photograph of Prince Charles sitting on a ski bob, sent it to the palace, and got a reply in which the mistake was confirmed. And I've seen the letter, by the way. He really did get this. "It's the truth," Henry concluded triumphantly. The afternoon tea is set on the table, tea poured from a pot into thin cups with saucers, cake, homemade by Gillian, and fruit. Sitting there, I recall a past visit not long after the conservatory was built, when my son fell and split his lip on the cool, newly laid tiles. The blood oozed between his just-cut teeth, and my fluttering panic, still then shockingly unfamiliar to me as a new mother, burst open like a wound. Gillian's husband, who is a dentist but kindly assumed the role of doctor for the duration, picked him up, examined his dainty, screaming mouth, and diagnosed him to be fine. There's nothing remarkable about this memory. My son fell in 100 other places, especially around that time when he had a tragic habit of falling flat on his face as he was careering towards an object of desire. And yet, this mundane scrap of family history flashes before my eyes whenever I sit in that sunny conservatory, making conversation, drinking tea, and eating freshly washed and cut strawberries selected from a big bowl. The hardness of that floor will always make me wince. When I ask if anyone else remembers, the answer, unsurprisingly, is no. It is the memory of a mother, and mine alone. Henry is recovering from a desperately needed and valiantly fought for hip operation. He stands up to greet us and takes a few careful steps towards me, flashing his trademark grin. We all cheer. Ingrid, who is a few months younger than her husband, remains sitting on the sofa, blinking amused eyes behind thick glasses. She keeps asking, "Why are we here? And when are we going home?" Both excellent questions, the answers to which in this moment are, "Because it's Henry's birthday weekend, and not today, Mummy." Ingrid has vascular dementia. Sometimes when I see her, she remembers a little more, sometimes less. Wading into her deep past is more reliable than staying in the shallows, but there is nothing linear about the loss of memory. It seems to be as much about what endures as what falls away, and what remains in Ingrid's case is life distilled to its poetics. Humour, music, family, childhood, and beneath all this, like an anchor lodged in the seabed of her past, Henry. Also present at this celebration of one man's life are my two children. My daughter runs around charming everyone with her irrepressible one-year-oldness, blowing kisses to a digger on the hills. My son, who is 5, goes straight upstairs to play in a bed. He is autistic and not in general a fan of parties, however small, significant, or hard-won. This is all 3. Only weeks earlier, Hilary, Henry and Ingrid's older daughter, phoned to ask me if I would be willing to write Henry's obituary, if the hip operation was unsuccessful. Later, however, my son agrees to join us in the conservatory scene of the split lip. He instantly spots the room divide between conservatory and lounge as not just a potential train track, but an actual literal train track. He drops to his knees with his head on the ground, as has been his favoured stance since he could command his body at all. He runs an imaginary train back and forth along the track. He makes train noises. He demands a ticket. Henry watches with great interest, and I watch Henry. Then he gets up slowly and shuffles over to my son. He stands there for a while, asking nothing of him, staying out of his space, intuitively doing all the things parents of autistic children desperately want others to do in their company. It occurs to me that all three of us are thinking about trains, yet our trains of thought are running on completely separate tracks. Eventually, I fish around for a ticket in my pocket and come up with a loyalty card for a cafe near where we live on the opposite side of Edinburgh. I hand it to Henry and he hands it to my son. We don't stay long. Parties are a tiring business for young and old. Before we leave, I sit on the floor beside Henry, and he tells me that for the first time in his life, he feels his age. A dear friend of his died recently. He was only a year younger than Henry, 94, and his name too was Henry Rose. The Wugas and the Roses had been true friends for decades. They used to go on family holidays to Cornwall in the 1950s with their daughters, which touches me because when I was a little girl, 3 decades later, my mother and father took their daughters, my sister and I, to Cornwall on holiday too. Since Henry Rose's death, his daughters have begun uncovering the most remarkable facts about his life, which, like so many, he never spoke about. Henry goes quiet. The conversation, through our silent but mutual agreement, is at its end. A few weeks later, I get an email from Henry. My inbox and heart will be full of him by this point. I've been interviewing Henry for years. We've become friends, and in recent months, the conversations have started increasing in length, scope, and urgency. I'm still considering what to do with them, but it's becoming clearer by the day that something must be done. In the meantime, every exchange seems to spawn another. Every story constructs a bridge to another time. I feel a little apprehensive, but honoured that you wish to write about my story, writes Henry. I would be pleased to meet with you as often as you would like. You will have access to all my documents, files, photos, and my writings, journals, etc. His email then turns to his dear friend, Henry Rose. Lost his whole family, Henry continues. He never talked about it. Some people simply draw the line then and now. Henry, however, chose a different way. Or perhaps it would be truer to say that the path of his own past permitted him, like a right of way, to speak out. Maybe I talked too much, is how he puts it, but I was safe in Britain and escaped the horrors of the Shoah. Look forward to talking with you, he concludes. Hope I can answer all your questions. Thank you. It's so lovely because reading that, so many people who are in that chapter are actually in this room.
I mean, I think we can see, Chitra, just from that short passage, this is a book about lots of things. I mean, it's got a kind of controlled capaciousness. You know, it's Henry's story, but it's so many other ideas and motifs and meander, you know, and ghosts and influences. Can you say a little bit about that wider, I guess, like other influences on the book? And I'm thinking here, I think maybe you mentioned Baldwin, but Sebald as well is in there. Yeah, just a little bit, unpack that a little bit for us, if you would.
Yeah, there was some absolutely sort of titanic influences when it came to this book. Definitely Baldwin, definitely Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. It's the only novel I've ever read that's about a Kindertransportee, which in some ways you would think there would be so many novels about that. Well, if there are, I really couldn't find them. There was just this one, and, you know, it came out in 2001, months before Sebald died, completely out of nowhere in a car crash in Norwich, and considered to be his masterpiece. And a book, I think there's a funny thing, it's a bit like Ulysses, isn't it? W.G. Sebald. If somebody starts talking about Sebald, you go, oh my God, you know, I haven't read him, and run in the other direction. And I was quite intimidated by that book and sort of had received some strange sort of socio-historical message that book wasn't for me. And yet when I read it, there was something about the layers of bearing witness and the remove of it, and the problem really of telling somebody's story, which is, is such a difficult thing to do when it's about anything, but when it's about the Holocaust, I think it is especially difficult. And Sebald's way into that is to always be bearing witness at one remove. So he's always telling someone else's story. So I tried to bring Sebald into my book as another layer of remove. A really sort of clear example of that is I write a chapter about Henry's grandmother, his maternal grandmother, who died in Terezin, in Theresienstadt. And I knew a little bit about Henry's grandmother. I'd seen photos of her. I knew much more about Henry's mother, Laura. I wrote a huge amount about her, a whole chapter on her. But I didn't know that much about his grandmother. So almost the way that I ended up writing that particular chapter was about writing about Sebald, writing about Theresienstadt. So it's like ways of getting into somebody's story, almost as a mark of respect, but also as a way of showing the kind of the depth of feeling and compassion and an attempt at a reach to try and reach out and really tell somebody's story, not through saying, I'm going to imagine my way into Henry Wuga's body, but in saying, I'm going to stand alongside you and put my story next to yours. So it felt like the most respectful way to do it. In the introduction to Austerlitz, it's described as an act of withholding, which I think is so beautiful. And I've tried to do that as well, because while really paying respect to our friendship as well, because I think that's where the meaning in this story is. So it's about putting my story next to Henry's, but never in a way of comparing them. I found that very, very difficult, but also the most worthwhile way.
We are going to come back to that, but before we let go of Austerlitz, which I read for the first time ahead of chatting to you tonight.
And Henry did too. Henry hadn't read it either, and he also read it. Wow. So, I don't think people necessarily read this book, and that's just another brilliant thing about Henry. I mentioned in passing, I've been reading Sebald, and I think it's going to feature in quite a big way in my book. And I think I saw Henry a week later, and he was like, yeah, I ordered Sebald, and I've read it. I was like, oh. And he said, I loved it.
I think we'd all love to have been a fly on the wall in these particular sort of research conversations and sessions. But Austerlitz is obviously it's about a really sad, life, but it's just a really sad book in a way that your book covers a lot of very difficult and challenging and sad territory, but it's not, even though, we quoted The Guardian at the start saying it was an achingly beautiful, kind of there was an ache there. I think it's a really joyful book, and I just wanted to, I guess, ask you a little bit more about that sort of getting that balance. Is that a deliberate consideration in approaching this book and this material for you?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I don't think I intentionally wanted to write a joyful book, but I definitely wanted to write a hopeful book. And I think that was a really strong response to the righteous and the right-minded levels of despair that I think so many of us are feeling now. But I wanted to write a book about connection in the face of that. And also, we hear so much about polarization. And I wanted to write a book that was almost the opposite of polarization, which is a kind of unity and friendship. And so that was my way of, it sounds really sort of cheesy to talk about putting something good into the world, but I really did want to write something positive about the friendships that are struck up all the time, perhaps even more so in a very polarized world. And I read a brilliant thing by the thinker Hannah Arendt, who was also interned, like Henry. And she wrote this amazing piece about how in very, very difficult times, like times of war or a pandemic would definitely fit that as well, other sort of differences sometimes melt away. And, you know, Henry and I, we may be at face value extremely different. You know, he's in his 90s, I'm in my 40s, I'm the daughter of Indian immigrants, he is a German Jewish refugee. All of our kind of references are completely different. And yet, I think sometimes when times are very, very tough, it's almost like those differences fall away and you connect on things like values, what matters, you know, what you're willing to stand up for, your principles. And so we connected on that. And I think the other thing is this book is really so strongly about family. And so there's huge amounts of kind of joy in that. And I watched a Zadie Smith, brilliant Zadie Smith, well, everything she does is brilliant, isn't she? With the London Symphony Orchestra a few days ago. And she was talking about something she had read by Julian Barnes. And when she said it, I thought that's exactly what my book is. And it's a quote, and it says, it hurts exactly as much as it's worth. And so that applies completely to the very, very worst of humanity, the Holocaust, and the very, very best, which is the likes of Henry and Ingrid Wuga, and their resilience and their survival and their absolute commitment to live a good life.
Yeah, here.
And that is joyous. It gives me joy.
Same. I love that Barnes quote.
It's amazing,
isn't
isn't
me
it?
off on another,
yeah,
like,
I
going somewhere
know.
else
It
now.
hurts exactly as much as it's worth. It's brilliant.
It makes me think of something around grief, that grief is as big as the love, which of course leads me to speak a bit more about your mother, who is very, very central in this book.
Very.
I wonder if you would like to tell us just a bit about her. I think in the book you said there's a hole in this story, it is mother-shaped and I do not know how to fill it. How did you start to work up to filling that?
Well, something really spooky happened while I was writing the book, is I just could not stop writing about fathers and men. And it was almost like the kind of, you know, the patriarchal hand of history was like bearing down on my laptop. I was going to say on my pen, but that's not right. On my laptop. And like all that came out was just like men, the history of men. And of course, I was writing a book about a man, so to some extent that was reasonable. But I also, like, Henry's mother was such a critical, she's the reason that he got on that train. Henry's mother, a woman called Laura Wuga, she's the one who managed to get him a place on the kinder transport. And her story is absolutely central to this book. And then, of course, my own mother, who, as I was writing, the other thing I knew was going to happen when I was writing this book, because I wanted to write it in the present tense and I wanted to write it in a very present, living way, a little bit like Deborah Levy, her idea of living autobiography. So my mum had incurable breast cancer, and so I knew that through the writing of this book she was going to die. It was obviously an absolutely terrible thing to know. And she did die. She died on June 3rd of 2020. And then Ingrid, Henry's wife, died 4 months later. So there are 2 deaths in this book. And I knew certainly that there was going to be one, and that it was going to permeate this book somehow. I didn't know what it was going to do. And I didn't know that it was going to happen in a lockdown and at the start of a pandemic. So all these other forces started coming into my book. And it meant that there was a very gradual emergence of the mother. And that seemed so right, actually, really powerful, that there's the one who's there from the start, you know, from birthing you and breastfeeding you and taking care of you. And we're talking about 3 very, very good mothers here, Laura Wuga, Ingrid Wuga, and Chitra Ramaswamy, my mum. And they emerged slowly and they remained quite invisible for the first half of the book, but then they emerged and they became its kind of steely backbone. And I thought there's something so powerful and representative of kind of motherhood in that. And when it came to writing the chapters about my mum's death, I honestly wrote them in an absolute maelstrom of grief. I almost don't remember writing them. I've never written like that. And it was in lockdown as well. So, I mean, the children were at home. I don't know what the hell I was doing, to be honest. It really is the strangest thing. But a number of people have said to me that they think that they're the best chapters in the book, which just goes to show sometimes the things that come straight from the heart that is broken. And my heart is broken, and it hurts as much as it's worth. So I don't even find that to be a sad thing, really. It's a necessary pain that I do not want to go away.
I mean, they are stunningly beautiful, and I think we could talk for longer on those chapters alone.
Well, thank you for bringing up my mum. I do like to talk about her a lot.
It's just an iconic trio there at the very heart of the book, these three women. Time marches, and I think it might be time to bring Henry Wuga onto the stage. So while we're getting ourselves ready there, I will remind you all that there's going to be time for you to ask questions and share your comments, so do have a little think. But while we're waiting for Henry to join us, Chitra, maybe I could just ask you just a little supplementary question.
My hand's shaking because I've been talking about grief.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's nice.
I think it's just about you, in those passages, the books you read with your mum. It seemed to me that books are a home in a book about Homelands, those books that you shared together. And I wondered if you wanted to say just a little bit more while we get Henry here.
Well, actually, the shelves in my mum and dad's flat, the bookshelves, I love, because objects are a massive part of this book. And the bookshelves in my mum and dad's flat, I love things that are very representative. And there is something so representative about, you know, it would be like all these kind of Kannada books. That's the language that my parents speak. Henry, can I help you? And then, you know, alongside loads of Agatha Christie, and it's just, I love seeing all of that all together, and I think the Wugas really share that, a real ability to be both completely proud of your motherland, and also to be completely in love with your homeland, and for them to not necessarily be in conflict. And I think that's, again, part of the reason why Henry and I have connected. Hi, Henry.
Good evening, Chitra. Thank you very much. This wonderful young lady in beautiful black and white, stylish as usual, she's telling you about writing a book about friendship. She talks a lot about Henry and Ingrid, but really the book is about friendship between two families. How did all this come about? As Chitra said herself, I don't think she'd ever met immigrant German Jewish couple before. And anyway, what can I tell you? Ingrid and I did a lot of talking in schools. And we were fairly busy lecturing. And I got a phone call from Chitra through the Scotsman. The Scotsman, yes. Could I be interviewed? I said, well, I don't really want to be interviewed. We've just been out working all day, talking all day. Nevertheless, we agreed to it. And a few days later, Chitra arrived with an editor and a photographer. And, well, I've had lots of interviews. But Ingrid and I, we've never had an interview by a person like that. It's just, no, that's what started the friendship. I mean, she's just different. She asks the right questions. She digs deeply, but she's charming about it. And Ingrid and I, we looked at each other. And the next day appears a double-page spread in the Scotsman, written by Chitra. And when I read it, I said, wow, my first impressions were right. This is a person we want to be in touch with. And we asked Chitra for lunch the week after, and she came, and that started it off. You're interviewed by lots of people, but there was an immediate getting together. I can't explain to you why. It's not only her charm and her intelligence and her wide knowledge, But being an incomer, both of us, it really has had a lot to do with it. It had a lot to do with it, really. Then eventually I met her mom and dad. Her dad is here tonight. And I met her mom and dad. And where would I meet them, of course? At the Edinburgh Festival. Where else would you meet? Only in a theatre. I think it was the Queen's Hall. You see, on a morning concert. Because that was important. Edinburgh Festival is very important to Ingrid and I, and obviously very important to the Ramaswamy family. So that's where we met. Long time ago, but I remember it well. I remember your mother well. It was such a short interview. So this thing grew up. And then Chitra, well, can I interview? I said, by all means. And she asked deep questions. And I gave her all, I'm not shy, as I said, I talk too much, but nevertheless, I could see she wants to know the story. And we covered that story over several years. She wrote about it. And then she said, I'm going to write a book about that. She said, the book will write itself. Well, whatever.
If only it had.
Then of course, the two children. I mean, they're lovely. It's a lovely family, it's clear, and the children. And that's how it went on. We became great friends. It had a lot, really, it has a lot to do that we are both sort of incomers. You're not as much as we are new incomers. You were born here, but nevertheless your parents came from India. And that had a lot to do with it. And I think, unfortunately, at the present time, with what's going on in the Ukraine, not very pleasant. So we became friends. And friends, it's gone on now for 12, 14 years. And it's absolutely marvelous. Now, not only, I know I said that in Glasgow, but not only does she write beautifully, it's not chronological. She dips in here and there, and then she goes into something else altogether and brings all that together, which makes it such a wonderful, interesting book to read. Then I have to, I know, I have to say that again. In the Times on a Saturday, there's a section called Alba. If you get the Times, you take the Alba. In the section of Alba, there is Chitra Ramaswamy writes about food. She is a restaurant critic. But she's a restaurant critic with a difference. It's not just, it costs that much, it was very nice. No, it goes further. Who are they? Why are they doing it? Where does the food come from? Is it from Scotland? Is it from a certain law? What history? I mean, you know, it's really, it's a food review you should read. It's good. It's fun. It's really fun.
I told you he's my adopted Jewish grandfather. No. Only a grandparent would say something so embarrassing.
Your honesty. You will say, the service was not good. It could be a lot better. I mean, she's not shy to write it. It's an honest review of food. So I like that, and I like it very much. I like all the things you do, and we do together, your family, and over the years, we've done a lot together, and it's absolutely marvelous. I can, the book is really, I know it's hard for me to say, but it's really, it's a lovely book. It's worth reading.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you.
I did want to ask you, Henry. I did want to ask. We've heard the Guardian review of the book, and I wondered if you had any further thoughts on we want your review of the book more importantly than the Guardian's. Is it good to have the story shared in this way?
It's good to have the story shared in this way. As I say, she brings in not only her family, her children, her partner, our family, my mother. She goes further and she knots it together, yes? My grandmother was in Theresienstadt, she perished there. So these are all things which are important for the story. But it's really, it's so well written, and it's just different. It's just different. It's more than just a friendship. It's I know it's not for me to recommend the book, but it is. It's really very good. You write beautifully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry.
I think we might well take some questions from the audience, both here in the store and online. Does anyone in the room, first of all, have a question they want to kick us off with? And we've got a roving mic. Anyone at all? Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for writing the story and telling us about the stories. I'd love to hear more about your decisions and the process of what Henry called the knotting together, the way you decided to craft it, or the way it crafted itself, all these different stories and memories and the risk of losing the memories as well. How did you build the knots that do hold it all together?
So it's a question really about the structure and this decision. Actually, I know she was here a few nights ago. Ali Smith was quite an early reader of this manuscript. She offered to read some early chapters for me, and at that time, everything was in the past. I was writing in the past tense, and I had this very, very clever idea. And it was classic writer's idea that seems really clever and is actually just a complete nightmare that no one else is ever going to care about. And I thought what would be brilliant would be to have Henry's train journey in the centre of the book. So Henry would get on the train right in the middle of the book. And then all of the kind of history, both his and my history, would be almost like ripples in concentric circles coming. It sounds so complicated. And as I tried to write it, it just was a nightmare. And every chapter that I wrote, the early chapters of this book, were like 10,000 words long. And I just couldn't seem to be succinct. And all of the ideas, there was too much material and too many, the weight of the story. It's almost like, when you go to the hairdresser and they thin out your hair. I needed to find a way to thin out the layers. And Ali Smith read those chapters and she said, put everything in the present tense. The prose is dead and you need to wake it up and bring it back to life and put everything in the present tense. And what was fascinating was as soon as I did that, I realised something absolutely critical, which in a way is a sort of spoiler, but it's not, is that the train journey needed to happen at the end of the book. Because I felt at once that this was going to be this is like the defining moment of Henry's life and a refugee's life is the journey, but also it's the bit that we all kind of obsess over. And we make it definitive, and it's only one aspect of a refugee's life. And we so rarely, for example, talk about Jewish refugees in Britain after the war. What happened in the 50s, what happened in the 60s and the 70s. And so I wanted the train journey to be both completely defining and also a springboard. So the book would almost end at the moment where he gets off the train on platform 1, at Glasgow Central Station, and he's off. But you already know, obviously, by the end of the book, everything else that's happening. And actually, it's interesting, Peggy, that you mentioned TV right at the start of this. And I am a TV critic, and more than that, just an obsessive TV watcher my entire life. And TV was quite an influence as well. The whole way that TV works now, like that sort of J.J. Abrams Lost thing, where you get the flash forward. And the idea of the flash forward, of already knowing what happens in the future, and then it makes the past so much more moving. And you feel it more as you're travelling through it. So you kind of want history to be alive and present and continuous, but at the same time, a lot of the time you already know what's going to happen in the future, but it only increases the drama. So those were really critical decisions. And once I made them, it was so weird, but I almost started writing the book again, and then these really short chapters. I wrote one chapter, we went away for a week, and I said to Claire before we went away, I'm going to write a chapter every single day while we're away. And keep in mind, at the time, I was writing chapters that were like 10, 15,000 words that were taking me months to write. But I did it. In 7 days, I wrote 7 chapters, and one was about, Henry and Ingrid meeting my son when he was 5 days old. So just tiny little snapshots, tiny little memories. And because that's the way that memory works as well, isn't it? That you can just have this little kernel, but it means so much.
We've got a question from home now, from a live stream viewer, Gabriella.
She's my editor at the Times.
Hey, there you go.
She's probably saying, wants to say thank you to Henry for plugging me.
She'll be typing furiously at this moment, I'm sure, as I ask this question. So Gabriella says, can you tell us more about how you did the research side of the book? Did you use archives, or was it all from Henry's documents and letters, or a combination of both?
Yeah, great question. So Henry's got this amazing archive. He's kept everything. He's a brilliant collector. So he's got everything from photos to all of the letters. His mum wrote him the most beautiful letters in the ruins of Nuremberg after the war. In the space of about 18 months, she wrote about 25 letters, and a wonderful young man called Kit translated them all for me. And they were very critical as well. I made the decision to put lots of these photos in the book, beautiful photos from throughout Henry's life. And then also in 2018, just as the Windrush scandal was breaking, Henry got a huge file from the National Archives detailing all of those, the months of internment and what suspicions he had both at the time during the war and in the decades afterwards, that he had been investigated by MI5 and that they had thought that he was a communist spy. And it was a hunch, but it was one that was real. And he got this file in 2018, and it showed that actually this was all true, and that he was very, very nearly refused naturalization as a result. So that was a 48-page file, and it was absolutely instrumental to the research as well.
Yes, I kept all the letters. I'm a collector. I kept everything. I've still got letters from my friends at school. I'm talking about 1937, 38. They're all in a file. And then came these letters from my mother, which were then translated. So, I mean, it's all there. It's really, it's not a matter of easy, but you had access to everything that was there.
And a lot of it is in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. They hold the archive there. So I know, obviously, because of the pandemic and everything, I never got to go.
And of course, when I read the first book that Chitra wrote, Expecting, when I read that, I said, wow, what a writer. And when she said, I would like to write about you, I felt very honored that a writer like that should write the story of my family and her family together, because there is an interconnection. I mean, you talk about Windrush. I know, I remember that. We had the same problem when we came here. You're an incomer, you're a foreigner, nobody wants you, but things evolve. And your family, I mean, I know, as you say, Chitra picks out little things. With her son at Gillian's house in Edinburgh, he went down on the floor and he hurt his face on between the two doors, but this became a railway track. So all of a sudden, a railway track has become important between Oren and you and I. I mean, it's, you know, when he goes on a train now, he gets a ticket, it's a railway. So from this little incident, a whole story evolves, which is very nice.
Lovely, lovely, Henry. Henry, we're going to try and fit in one more question, I think, and we've got one from...
We've got one from online. It feels important to mention that Gabriella did type "haha." Now, Alice asks, this is one for you, Henry. Alice at home asks, did you ever consider writing your story yourself?
Well, not... Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, I wrote about 12 years ago. I wrote a little booklet. It was published, not published privately, to my grandchildren. So I told the story to my grandchildren, and Hilary read it to me the other day. It's quite good. I was amazed.
I've read it. It is good. It is
Very
good.
nice. But I never felt like writing a book. But I do write a lot of essays. So everything I write down, I wrote, for example, the first 23 months arriving in Great Britain, the times I spent in various children's homes, holiday homes, even before the war, when my mother sent me, at the age of 6, I was a sickly little boy, and I was sent to the mountains, the Black Forest, for fresh air, and I got sick there. And I remember these things. Walking into this children's home in 1937 as a little boy, I remember to this day, the matron is standing outside, and as she went in, she said, left, right. She looked at us. What was she looking for? She was looking for our skin color. You're allowed to sit in the sun, you are not. Sun, not sun, sun, not sun. I remember that. I mean, this is so long ago, but I can still see that woman standing there. And she meant well, she did it well. And those of us that were allowed to sit in the sun, we were allowed outside a lot, and the others were not, so great.
I think I've just got one final little question for Chitra, and then we're done. Then we just clap lots for everyone. Something you said, Chitra, about the flash forward. And this is something in the book where, sort of near the start, you say, in the future, I will start to understand that belonging lies in the search, which is a line that really stayed with me. And I just wonder if in writing this book, it took you closer to that kind of, or it changed how you feel about home and belonging.
Yeah, I think it really has, actually. I mean, how often do you write a book that sort of changes your life? But yeah, it definitely has. I think what I realised was a kind of a real solidarity. And again, it sort of runs counter to this narrative of polarisation and sort of culture wars and all the rest of it, which I know, we have very real problems in our societies. I'm not saying that's not the case. But there's something about that kind of, that common ground and that shared experience. And also, it's definitely true to say that whenever I found myself in very difficult, moments of crisis, like the weeks and months leading up to my mum's death, when I wasn't able to go and be with her in London because we weren't allowed to travel then. And what are the ways in which we survive through such moments? Well, definitely for me, what I was doing at that moment in the book was I was reading Laura Wuga's letters, Henry's mother's letters. And it was her kind of fortitude in post-war Nuremberg. In the book, I describe it as a kind of a cold sea, like a wild swimmer, shocking themselves back to life in a cold sea. That's what those letters did for me. And it was, it's my friendship with Henry as well, that I often do think when I'm in very difficult spots or when life is hard, I think, what would Henry do? And it helps me. And in that way, that's what an inspirational person means. That's what it means to be an inspirational person, to be inspired by someone else. And that has been so true for me in very practical ways. There's a moment in the book where my mum is dying in London. We'd just been in London, and I emailed Henry and Ingrid and the daughters a group email to the Wugas to sort of say, this is happening and I'm heartbroken. And Henry just sent me back this beautiful email, and there was just one line in it that he said, be brave, you are prepared for anything that will happen. And he was right, and I was. And it's thanks to him.
May I also say, when you've read the book, at the end, there's another whole book. I mean, the amount of research that Chitra has done.
Don't worry,
there
isn't really.
There are pages which are absolutely
like a trapdoor.
fantastic. This shows me, her input into everything is just, it's fantastic.
what a gift to all of us that we can all, you know, what would Henry do? What a gift we can all take off into the spring evening. It just left for us to kind of thank both Henry and Chitra so much, and for you for coming.